Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to pattern and sew a ponytail like this. So this ponytail is made up of a couple of components. It has this base part and then the ponytail itself. So this base is meant to look like when you pull your hair back into a ponytail, you have this little dome of hair that forms at the base of your head that shapes into the ponytail itself. So I'm going to walk through how I pattern both this base part and the ponytail that connects to it. And I've made it out of faux fur, but you can also make it out of minky. And I start by patterning it in minky because it's much easier to pattern in minky than in faux fur. So if you just wanted to use minky, you can pretty much stop at the minky part and move forward from there. So what I've done here is printed out my ponytail to scale with my plush. And if you don't have a printer, that's okay. You can just draw it out yourself from the side. But I do recommend that you get a printer if you plan on doing a lot of patterning for plushies. It really will make your life a lot easier. So I'm going to not only make this actual ponytail shape, but I'm also going to pattern this hair piece that scrunches up into the ponytail. So the first thing I want to do is complete this line here, which meets the top of the head. And this is going to be the general curve of my head right here. But we want to make this a outward circular shape because where it meets the head, if we had it cave inward like this, it's not going to quite make a round shape, which is how we want the hair to look. So we're going to curve this outward, and on top of that I'm going to actually extend this inward a bit from where it actually lands with the side of the head, because I'm going to attach this piece with machine sewing. So I'm going to use my attaching appendages technique, which I'll link that video if you would like a more in-depth instruction on that. But I will walk through that process in this video as well. So I'm going to extend this outward a little bit because I want extra fabric to attach it to my test plush, so that way I can more easily get the pattern from it and have some extra fabric to work with, as opposed to cutting it a little bit close and not quite getting the pattern that I want. So now that I've extended it outward, I'm just going to draw that outward facing curve that I want. And because I don't want this back headpiece to extend too far out from my plush, I'm not going to add any seam allowance to this top piece. I'm going to just assume that I already have my seam allowance in my piece. But if you needed to, you could go ahead and add seam allowance. Or if you don't add seam allowance to your plush patterns, then you can go ahead and omit it as you usually do. This is going to give me a nice curve from a side view, but if I were to look at it from the back, it would still be pretty flat. So if I look at this test plush that I've been working with to make this piece, you can see how nice and curved it is from the side, and from the back I also have that curved shape, and that's from adding a seam right along the middle right here. Now if I didn't add this seam, this view from the back would be very narrow to the head and wouldn't make a rounded shape like we want. So what you want to do is add another seam that runs down the middle here and then curve it outward. So right now we're just going to worry about placing this seam, and I'm just going to make it hit right in the middle of this ponytail here. And eventually when we cut out this piece of paper, we're going to curve this seam outward just like we did here. But for now, we're just going to mark the placement. So now I also want to work on the shape of the actual ponytail itself. This little area right here is getting pretty narrow, so eventually I'm going to extend this outward just a little bit, maybe a 1/4 inch, so that I can actually make some kind of scrunchie that goes here in the hair. This is just getting a little too tight for plush making. I just want to give myself a little bit extra wiggle room. I'm also going to flatten this area right here instead of having that little divot. It's a bit too detailed for me. I'm actually going to end up making this out of faux fur, and this little detail right here would just get lost, this little dip right here. So I'm just going to make this a straight line instead. I'm going to go ahead and add seam allowance to this ponytail. I'm going to eyeball a 1/4 inch. And like I said, I am actually going to make this out of faux fur, but I'm going to first pattern it with minky because it's a lot easier to pattern with minky rather than faux fur. So I'm actually going to end up having to cut down the length of this pattern eventually because faux fur has a much longer pile than minky does. So if I were to use this pattern for the ponytail on faux fur, it's going to end up being much longer than it would be with minky because the fur itself is so much longer. And on this shape here, I am getting close to my actual seam allowance on this shape, so I'm just going to stop right here and then finish this piece off after I cut it out. So the last thing I want to think about before moving on to the next step is how I'm going to attach this ponytail to this scrunched up hair piece. I'm going to have this circle piece actually end up being 4 patterned pieces that make up this scrunched up hair piece. And one of the reasons for that is shape. Like I mentioned, you want to get that nice circular shape just by having it from the side and also from this side seam here. The other reason is that I actually want to run my pile in different ways. So I want my pile of my minky to run in this direction towards the ponytail, this way and this way. So this is going to have to be 2 different cuts as well. Now that means that I want the pile to run downward for my ponytail, which means this has to be a different cut of fabric. And so that means I'm going to have a 5th piece that makes my ponytail. And I could hand sew this onto the circular piece here. If you're working with minky, it would be easier, but I'm also working with faux fur eventually, and hand sewing 2 faux fur pieces together I find is really difficult. I also just don't like hand sewing in general. I find it very tedious, so I prefer to machine sew where I can. So I'm actually going to pattern this ponytail onto the base itself. I'm going to do that by first sewing 2 of these sides together and then sewing the side of the ponytail onto that, rather than sewing all 4 pieces of this base together and then sewing the ponytail together and then sewing those 2 pieces together, because the base is going to have a very small circle right in the middle where the ponytail joins. And if you're going to sew the ponytail into this little circle, that's going to be very difficult. But if you don't sew this base together and first sew one side of the ponytail onto it, that's going to be a lot easier. So I want to go ahead and pattern how those pieces meet. So I'm just going to extend this inward a little bit where the seam allowance is going to be on the edges of this ponytail. And I don't want it to end right here because I don't want to add extra length onto this ponytail besides what I choose that I'm going to add. I'm going to end my ponytail about a 1/4 inch in. So this is how I want the seam to look. You want to give it a nice little curve instead of it being a straight line. And now this little line here is what our seam is going to look like. So this is getting a little bit muddy here, but we're going to clean it up when we go ahead and cut it out, which I'm going to do now. Clean up this seam here. It's not quite 1/4 inch. So I've got this piece cut out, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut out the ponytail. So I'm gonna go right up here and cut in here and cut along this seam line. So now I just want to finish up this ponytail pattern piece real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and trace the area with the completed seam allowance. And then here I'm pretty close to my 1/4 inch, so maybe just a little bit in this corner. But this is the side where we trimmed at the seam we wanted. On top of that, I wanted to go ahead and extend this little area a bit. So I'm going to extend this about a 1/2 inch just to make sure that I get both my seam allowance and my extra space that I want. So this is my ponytail pattern. I'm gonna mark down on this just to remind myself that I want the pile to run in this direction. And so that pattern piece is finished. So now I have my base here, and what I want to do is curve this seam outward so that I get a nice circular shape. So I'm gonna cut right down this line, and then I need to add my seam allowance. So I need to add my seam allowance back to this area where I'm going to have the ponytail meet, and I also need to add seam allowance and my curve to this middle cut right here. So I'm just going to start by adding my seam allowance, which is just a 1/4 inch. And now I'm going to curve this piece outward. So I'm just going to do a little curve here just to give it some extra shape. And you don't want to go too far out at the bottom here, because if you think about where you're going to sew, you still want your seam to land right here. And so I'm also going to mark that this is the top piece of my hair. And I'm going to mark that I want the pile to run in the direction of this seam, so where the ponytail is going to end up. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this piece out because I want to use this side on my second piece so that it lines up perfectly. So I'm going to do the same process with the bottom piece. Going to trace the outside. Going to add the seam allowance where I need it. And now I can just use my top pattern piece and lay it on to the bottom where the seam lines up, and just trace it so that when I lay these pieces together, it's going to perfectly line up. I'm going to mark that this is the bottom and mark that I want the pile to run this way. So now I have my pattern pieces, and I can cut these out. Like I said, I'm going to pattern this out of minky, but eventually it's going to be faux fur. So I need to cut 2 of each of both of these, since I need a full circle for the back of the head. And then I need to cut 2 pieces for my ponytail as well. So I have my pieces cut out and ready to pin and sew together. I've done one side so you can see what I'm talking about, where I sewed one top to one bottom and then went ahead and sewed the ponytail onto the little area where we designated where the ponytail would be sewn onto. So it's going to be a lot easier to sew this piece together rather than to sew these 4 base pieces together and then sew a tiny circle onto a tiny ponytail. So you just want to pin the 2 sides together to make that overall side shape. So you're just going to sew this 1 seam that makes this side, and then once you do that, you go ahead and sew the side of the ponytail onto the area where it meets. And if you need to, you can make a little notch on the ponytail right in the middle where this seam is, because that's where your center should meet, but it should be pretty easy to line up. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this other side together. So now that I've sewn these 2 pieces together, I can take my ponytail and join it right here. I'm going to line up the middle of the ponytail with the seam on the back, pin it into place. And then sew right along here with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I have my 2 sides. I'm going to go ahead and pin them together and sew along the outside. So you just start at the top and then line up where your sides of your ponytail meet. So now I'm just going to sew all along this edge here, all the way to this side, and then I'm going to clip my seams right at these corners here to make it turn out a little bit cleaner, as well as at the bottom of this ponytail here to make sure I get that tip. And here I am turning this piece out. Because your ponytail can get a bit thin where it meets the base, it can be hard to turn outward. One tip is to generally you want to push it in rather than to try and pull it out. But you can also use a pair of forceps and kind of stick it in where the hole of the ponytail is and grab the edge with your forceps and just pull it. So it's kind of counterintuitive to the push don't pull, but if you have a pair of forceps then it's a little different. So then you can just also use them to stick out the bottom here. Okay, so now I have my ponytail piece that I can go ahead and start patterning onto my head and figure out how it's going to meet it. So I have my test head here, and then I have my hair piece, and I went ahead and stuffed it lightly just because I want to preserve that circular shape that we're going to have eventually when we go ahead and stuff this plush. But I'm going to go ahead and pin this onto the head the way that I want it to land. And this is where having that extra fabric around the edges comes in handy, because I want to pin it in a way where the extra fabric is tucked in to where when I draw where I want the seam to be, I'm automatically going to have some seam allowance to transfer to a pattern. And again, I have a video on the method I use to pattern attaching things to plushies, usually with appendages like a leg or an arm, even a tail. But I'm going to use that technique here, and it'll go more in depth on how to do this. So the things I want to keep in mind are that I want the top seam and the bottom seam to align with my back seam here. If you don't have a back seam, just make sure that it's centered. So I'm just going to start by pinning the top right behind this piece up here, which is going to become more hair eventually. But this is where I want my ponytail to start. And it doesn't have to be perfect on the first try. You can just keep adjusting this as desired. And then I'm gonna tuck in my fabric back here, pull it down. You should be able to get most of the way where you pull entirely down, since you pattern to scale with your plush, instead of having to guess where it is. And so now I just want to make sure that the edges are even. I do have a seam that nicely lands just on the edge of this pattern piece. So I just want to make sure that my side seams are just about even. It doesn't have to be perfect, because it is better to just take the pattern from one side and mirror it, rather than trying to make sure that your two pattern pieces are perfectly symmetrical. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin this in place on both sides, and then check what it looks like. So I do think this comes out way too far. I think this looks more like a hat right now than hair, and of course when I convert all of this to faux fur it'll look a little different, but this sticks out a little bit too much to my liking. So what I'm going to do is just take this off. I'm going to fold a little bit more fabric underneath here, so I'm going to have more space under here, just to make this piece not stick out as much. So I like this shape better. It doesn't stick out as much. You're going to lose a little bit of length when you do that, when you tuck in the seam allowance a bit more. So if it bothers you a lot, you can go ahead and repattern this and make it about the same length but not as tall. But for me, it doesn't bother me so much having it a bit shorter, because the rest of it is going to be faux fur, so the transition will look just fine. And for this little area up here, I'm not going to worry about this whole base piece coming up here, just because again it's all going to be faux fur. So I think this will blend nicely into this base piece once it's all the same type of fabric. So from here I'm going to take a water-soluble fabric pen and mark where these two pieces meet. So I want to mark where the seam is going to be. So I'm just going to draw right around the edge of the hair where it meets the head. And I'm going to stop right at the middle, because I just want to take one of these sides and use it as the pattern by mirroring it, rather than attempting to make this side perfectly symmetrical with the other side. And I also want to mark on the hair that same place. And because this is a circular shape, circles can be pretty difficult to sew together. You're going to want to go ahead and add some tick marks to help you align these pieces. So I'm going to add a tick mark where this seam is. So I'm just going to draw from this seam onto the head, and then I'll add a couple more just between this top seam and the side seam. And then this seam and the bottom seam. But you can add as many as you want. If you're new to sewing circles together, you might want to add a bunch. So now I can take this hair piece off and develop a pattern from it. I'm going to take the pins out. And so you can see how I have a circle on my head now where the hair is going to line up. That is my seam line, so I need to add seam allowance. Now, one thing I need to keep in mind is that this plush is made from minky, and I'm going to have faux fur be my final product, and minky stretches much more than faux fur does, which my faux fur does not stretch at all. So I want to be pretty generous with this seam allowance. I want to get it a pretty big seam allowance. By having a larger seam allowance, I can always make this circle larger, but I can't make it smaller without making a new piece. So I'm almost going to go to like a 3/8 or 1/2 inch seam allowance here, because I can easily make it larger. And if I'm having a hard time stretching the faux fur to meet, I can just go ahead and make this circle larger. So I'm also going to make sure that I don't lose track of these tick marks. So now I can take apart this plush for the pattern and cut out this inner circle here, because that's just going to be a big hole where I'm going to sew the ponytail piece into. So now I have to do the same thing with my ponytail piece, where I have my seam line marked, but I need to add seam allowance. And I'm going to add less seam allowance on this piece than I am for my circle, just because I would prefer to make my circle larger, because I want that to hit that seam line that I patterned out, and I can just cut the hole larger, and rather than to make to change this seam here. So I'm just going to draw in my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And because I have all this extra fabric that I allowed for, I can just draw my seam allowance directly onto that fabric. Whereas if I cut it a little too short anywhere, I wouldn't be able to mark the seam allowance, which isn't a huge problem, but you just have to remember to do that. It's a little hard to draw on this long pile minky. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I capture these tick marks here. So now I can go ahead and trim off this extra fabric. So now I can seam rip this piece here and use this side to develop my final pattern from. So I went ahead and finished up my pattern and then got it cut out of fur. I was conscious of the way that I had the fur run, so for this base hair I ran it towards the direction that the ponytail would go, as discussed earlier. I also trimmed down the length of the fur for this piece here so it wouldn't be so long and messy in the part where it forms the base of the ponytail. And I did decide to go ahead and split the ponytail into 2 pattern pieces. So if I flip it to the back so you can more easily see, I decided to cut the stem of the ponytail into its own separate pattern piece so that I can run the fur backwards. So the fur runs back in this direction and then the end of the ponytail points downward. So it just kind of helps sell the ponytail look a little bit more. So when I sew all this together, I get a shape like this. And so you can see I have the base piece here that forms the dome at the head, and then it transitions to the long fur here that forms the ponytail. Here's that middle pattern piece that forms the stem of the ponytail, and then transitioning down into the ponytail piece. So it's a little messy now because I need to sew it all together to this other piece once I get those pattern pieces made. But once I get it sewn and then go ahead and put something at the base of the ponytail to tidy up this messiness here, you'll be able to see the shapes a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this these pieces here get them sewn together and then get it sewn to the other side so that we can sew it onto the base of the head. So I've got the ponytail sewn together here. I've wrapped the ponytail area with just some muslin just so I can see what this will look like. I also did some further cleaning up of this fur around here. I trimmed the ends of it a little bit so that it laid cleaner going into the ponytail itself, and just generally trying to get it look like it's pulling back into this ponytail here. So I've also sewn together the base part of the hair where this ponytail gets sewn into. So now what you have to do is just pin these together, right sides together, lining up your tick marks along the way. So you just take your ponytail and make sure that the top is in the right direction, and then insert it into your base piece here. And my first tick mark is along the top seam of the ponytail with this top seam of the head. So I'm just going to line that up, pin it in place. And then I'm going to go to my bottom seam and line that up with the bottom seam of the head. Pin that. And now I'm just going to work my way around the other sides, lining up my tick marks and making sure that the fur is tucked into the seam. So you don't want any fur sticking out like this. You want to tuck it in because otherwise it's going to get caught in your seam, and then it'll be somewhat difficult to pull out the fur, although you can use a pin or a brush to pull the fur back out of the seam. So because my piece is so large, I'm not going to have a difficult time machine sewing this together. But if your piece was small, you might have to hand sew it, especially if you're making it very small, and having it be faux fur can be just very difficult to get precision with machine sewing. But luckily mine is big enough to where I can machine sew it. Okay, and now I can sew this together. I'm just going to do a normal stitch along my seam line here, and then we're pretty much done. So when I sew a piece like this, I like to set my needle to the left position, and when you're sewing faux fur you also want to do a longer stitch than you normally would. So I just have mine set to 4 millimeters, which is just a little bit shorter than what I would use for a basting stitch. But setting the needle to the left position, I find it easier just to line it up that way, just because when you're sewing these circles together where you're setting one circle inside the other, it can get a little difficult if you have your needle in the middle for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I prefer to have it on the left side, and then I just set my my piece underneath and sew all the way around. And so then I'll sew a small amount and then kind of pull my piece forward, sew a little bit more, and then pull it forward again So you're rotating your piece. And this piece is big enough to where I don't have to reposition my foot, but if I'm sewing a piece like this that's very small, I'll often have to backstitch, take the piece out, reposition it, and then keep going rather than being able to just pull the piece forward and continue stitching. Okay, all done. So just have to take the pins out. I'm very thankful I was able to machine sew this because this would have taken a lot longer if I had to hand sew this in. And it'd also be more sturdy by machine sewing it as well. Let's take a closer look at this now. So here it is all sewn in. I went ahead and cleaned up some of the fur that just got caught in the edges just a little bit. But it looks good. The seam is nice and everything looks even. So now we just have to finish up our head by sewing this piece into the head itself. And here's the finished product. This ponytail is nice and fluffy. It forms a nice shape at the back of the head as if he were pulling his hair into this actual ponytail. I still have some muslin here, so it's not the final wrap, but otherwise I think it looks really good. And from the back side, you can see that pulling effect and the transition that we have from the faux fur of the back of the head into this ponytail piece itself. And from the other side. So if you like this messy ponytail look from the faux fur, you can make it out of faux fur, but this would also work in minky as well. Hope you guys learned something today, and thanks for watching.